Update 2, my psychopathic mother-in-law tried to steal my farm. We FaceTimed my wife's uncle to get some more insight on the mother-in-law, or rather the professor. At first, her uncle gave very short answers. But when I told him about the weird play for the ranch, he finally was willing to give a bit more information. Turns out she tried the same thing with his farm. He said the professor was a big reason why him and his brother don't talk anymore. Wife's uncle's sheep farm was part of a much larger piece of land owned by my wife's grandfather. The grandfather had 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter went off to the East Coast and works a high-paying executive job of some type. The grandfather split his property into 3 slices when he died. His daughter sold her part to uncle for almost nothing. She didn't want rural property nor had she made a claim for it, and knew uncle wanted to keep the farm going. The other son, my father-in-law, sort of kept ownership but gave permission for uncle to keep using it. That was until he wanted to go to an expensive university. He sold his part of the land to uncle for a good chunk of change. Uncle got to keep all of grandfather's land in one piece. In college, father-in-law dated the professor, and then married. Uncle heard bits and pieces, but father-in-law just only called during Thanksgiving and his birthday, and that was about it for many years. A few years later professor was in, as the uncle called it, a hipster phase and heard about the farm. She didn't just show up. Father-in-law asked first and my uncle agreed, letting the professor and my future wife come over and work for a bit. Father-in-law knew what rural life was like, but the professor didn't. Uncle described it as the professor had a vision of waking up to a kale smoothie, digging up beets for lunch and enjoying the sun the rest of the day. If you live on a farm or a ranch, you're spoiled for choice when it comes to daily chores. Uncle's farm was primarily a sheep farm, but they had a vegetable garden and a small orchard. This meant work. Uncle was easy on the professor. She was only given a few chores, such as clipping dead vines in the garden and airing the compost. She apparently treated this like an ordeal. She nearly destroyed the tomatoes uncle was growing that year, and he had to redo the compost every evening. But the way she complained, you'd think she was tending the orchard and the sheep. She did not like manual labor. But she was also oddly in love with the idea of a farm. My wife on the other hand took to it like a duck to water. She loved to check the fences, check the flock, dole out the feed, and tend to the small vegetable garden. Uncle said that they had a local butcher that came once in a while for a few lambs, depending on price and demand. Butcher visited once during the professor's time on the farm. Butcher was a black man, which uncle didn't mind or care. Professor cared. She made a big show of greeting him, shaking his hand, and talking to him in a very sing-songy, high-pitched way. Uncle found this very strange. At least strange enough to mention to us. Professor wanted the farm, but didn't want to work it. She wanted to own it on paper and have the uncle and her husband work it. She went as far as to push her husband to contest the sale he had with uncle a few years back to gain a partial ownership. This went nowhere, of course. Uncle did have to hire a lawyer, but it didn't even make it to court. Him and the rest of the family refused to talk to father-in-law after that. I was curious, so I had to know why the professor blew up at me when I said I was blessed to have a wife. He chuckled a bit. Really kicked the hornet's nest, huh? He said. First night the professor was staying with uncle and his wife prepared dinner. They got to the table and uncle was about to say grace. My wife blushed when he brought this up. Apparently this is a very embarrassing memory for her. Professor blew up. She said something about how this family doesn't say grace. Uncle shrugged. He wanted to be accommodating and responded that she didn't have to join if she didn't want to. She tried to push it further. As long as she was in that house, there would be no saying grace. Uncle said this was the first time he was rude to the professor. He told her that there was no way a guest was telling him what he could and couldn't do in his own home. After hearing about the sheep farm, I will get in touch with a lawyer. We'll see how that goes.